There are moments in history that feel frozen in time, a single image, a single fall that ripples through the world long after the cameras leave. June 28, 2008. Manhattan. A quiet Saturday morning shattered by the sound of impact. On a busy street beneath a tall apartment building, bystanders stopped in stunned silence. Above them, windows reflected the sky. Below lay a young woman the fashion world once called the Russian Rapunzel. Ruslana Korshunova, 21 years old. A face the world couldn't stop looking at. A story no one fully understood. The headlines arrived within hours. Model falls to her death. Beauty queen's tragic end. But beneath the sensationalism was something far more fragile. The unraveling of a young woman caught between fantasy and reality. Before the tragedy, there was only awe. Ruslana's face was a canvas that designers, photographers, and editors worshipped. With her cascading, waist-length hair and ethereal features, she seemed to step out of a storybook. In the early 2000s, the fashion world was chasing a particular dream: pale, delicate, otherworldly beauty. Ruslana embodied it perfectly. Her look wasn't just in demand, it was iconic. She became the star of runway shows in Paris and Milan, graced the cover of French Vogue, appeared in Elle, and walked for Dior, Vera Wang, and Marc Jacobs. But behind every flawless editorial spread was a young woman from Kazakhstan, far from home, navigating an industry that rarely paused to ask how she felt. Ruslana was born in Almaty, Kazakhstan, in 1987, during the final years of the Soviet Union. She grew up surrounded by literature, language, and culture. Her friends remembered her as shy but imaginative, a girl who loved poetry and dreamed quietly of something bigger. There was no glamorous plan, no family legacy in fashion. Her journey began in one of the most unexpected ways: the early internet. In 2003, a British modeling scout stumbled across a personal online page, a casual photo of Ruslana, shared among friends. Her beauty stood out instantly. Within months, she was signed to an agency, flying to Europe, and stepping into a world she'd only seen in magazines. It was a digital age fairy tale, a teenage girl from Almaty discovered online and catapulted to global fame. Within just a few years, she transformed from an unknown teenager into one of the most in-demand faces on the runways. Designers called her angelic. Photographers described her as a muse who didn't even know she was one. But this sudden rise came with an unspoken cost: isolation, pressure, and expectations that no one her age could be fully prepared for. Ruslana's story begins like a dream, the kind of narrative the fashion industry loves to tell: small-town girl, big break, international success. But dreams, when filtered through the machinery of glamour and profit, often leave cracks beneath the surface. And for Ruslana, those cracks would slowly widen, until one summer morning in New York, everything shattered. For most models, fame is a slow climb. For Ruslana Korshunova, it happened almost overnight. Within a year of being discovered online, she was no longer the shy girl from Almaty. She was on the runways of Paris, New York, and Milan, commanding attention without uttering a single word. Designers adored her. Casting directors called her the face we've been waiting for. She walked for Dior, Vera Wang, and Marc Jacobs, her image appearing in campaigns that shaped early 2000s fashion. The world of haute couture embraced her with open arms, but it wasn't just her beauty that captivated people, it was the illusion she embodied. Ruslana seemed timeless, untouched by the chaos around her. She floated down runways like a character from a fairy tale, her hair flowing like silk behind her. The media quickly found its angle. They called her the Russian Rapunzel. Her impossibly long hair became a signature, a symbol of innocence, mystery, and beauty. Articles romanticized her background, turning her life into a modern fairy tale: the girl with the magic hair from Kazakhstan, now ruling Paris. This myth wasn't just flattering, it was branding. In an industry built on illusion, Ruslana became a character, a living, breathing archetype that magazines and designers could mold. But the more she became Rapunzel, the less space there was for Ruslana. The image was powerful, but it also trapped her in expectations, to always look ethereal, to never falter, to embody a fantasy that wasn't her own. Beneath the glamour, the reality was far harsher. The modeling industry in the mid-2000s was notoriously unforgiving. Long days, last-minute castings, endless flights, and constant pressure to maintain perfection. She was still a teenager, navigating contracts, schedules, and a whirlwind of attention. There was little time to breathe, let alone build a support system. In this world, youth was both currency and a ticking clock. The same qualities that made her desirable, innocence, mystery, beauty, also made her vulnerable. Agencies held the power. Photographers, designers, and editors shaped her narrative. Ruslana, like many young models, was swept into a machine that valued her image more than her V for a few shining years. Ruslana was at the top. She became the face of campaigns, the muse of photographers, the girl everyone wanted in their show. But meteoric rises often cast long shadows. In the glare of the spotlight, cracks begin to form, quiet moments of exhaustion, isolation, and confusion hidden behind flawless editorials. Ruslana had stepped into the world's most glamorous stage. What she didn't know was how little control she truly had over the script being written for her. For every photograph that looked like a dream, there were nights that felt like an echo. The higher Ruslana rose, the quieter her world became. Fame had brought visibility, but not connection. Behind the glowing lights of Fashion Week, loneliness settled in like an unwelcome goose living thousands of miles from home. Ruslana navigated a city and an industry that were both dazzling and indifferent. She was still in her late teens, surrounded by people yet often profoundly alone. Friends would later recall that she was gentle, thoughtful, sometimes withdrawn, a girl who preferred quiet corners to crowded after-parties. In interviews, traces of vulnerability slipped through. She spoke about missing home, about feeling lost in translation, about struggling to keep up with expectations. Journal entries and online posts revealed a young woman searching for meaning in a world that valued her appearance more than her words. The modeling world was fast, transactional, and emotionally demanding. There were no guides, no safety nets, no one to ask, "Are you okay?" For many foreign models, this isolation was invisible until it was, and by the late 2000s, fashion's taste was shifting. The ethereal Eastern European look that had defined the early decade was fading. New faces were coming in, and the demand that once orbited Ruslana's image was softening. For someone who had experienced a meteoric rise, this change could feel like a silent fall. Fewer bookings, shorter contracts, less attention. The industry didn't offer explanations, it simply moved on. For young models, that transition could be brutal. Identity was tied to relevance. And when relevance began to fade, so too could one's sense of purpose. Ruslana found herself at this crossroads, still beautiful, still talented, but facing a world that was beginning to look past her around this time. Ruslana reportedly became involved with a controversial organization known as Rose of the World. Marketed as a self-improvement and training group, it promised emotional breakthroughs and personal growth. But those who attended described intense psychological methods, long sessions, emotional pressure, and unsettling tactics. Friends noticed changes in her behavior after attending. She spoke of transformation, of wanting to start a new life, but there was also confusion in her words, a mix of hope and unease. The lines between empowerment and control were blurred. For someone already feeling isolated and uncertain, such groups could provide both a sense of belonging and an invisible grip. The fairy tale was beginning to fracture. Ruslana was searching for something real, meaning, direction, identity, as the industry that once embraced her began to turn away. In that space of emotional vulnerability, new influences entered. And slowly, the cracks beneath the surface widened, setting the stage for her final days. Every tragedy has a timeline, a string of moments that seem ordinary at first, but become painfully significant when looked at in reverse. For Ruslana Korshunova, Those final days were filled with whispers of change, cryptic messages, and an invisible weight present in the weeks leading up to June 28, 2008. Ruslana's online presence began to shift. Friends noticed her posting more reflective, sometimes sorrowful messages. On her social media, she wrote, "I'm so lost. Will I ever find myself?" It wasn't the language of someone basking in glamour, it was a quiet cry from someone searching for meaning in a life that looked perfect from the outside. She had also spoken of wanting a fresh start. Some say she considered leaving modeling altogether. Others recall her expressing fatigue, not just physical, but emotional. The girl once painted as a fairy tale character was beginning to write her own, more uncertain story. Those close to her remember a mixture of hope and heaviness. She was talking about change, but there was also something distant in her eyes, as if she was somewhere between two worlds, the one she was leaving and the one she hadn't yet found. June 28, 2008, a warm Saturday in Manhattan. Early in the day, Ruslana spoke with her mother on the phone. It seemed like an ordinary conversation. She made no mention of distress, no warning signs. Later, she was seen in her apartment building. Witnesses described her as quiet but composed. Around midday, she returned home alone. And then, sometime in the early afternoon, she fell from the balcony of her 9th-floor apartment. The fall was fatal. The impact was heard across the street. Within minutes, police and paramedics arrived. News crews followed soon after. By evening, the image of the young model's body, covered with a white sheet, was being broadcast around the world. She was just 21. The NYPD quickly ruled it a suicide. They pointed to the lack of signs of struggle, the open balcony door, and her recent emotional posts. But questions lingered, questions that still echo today. Neighbors reported hearing a loud scream before the fall. Some said the position of her body didn't entirely match a straightforward jump. Friends insisted she hadn't seemed suicidal. And then there was the Rose of the World Connection, the self-improvement group she had recently attended, known for intense psychological practices. Some began to suspect that her death wasn't entirely straightforward. Was it despair? Was it influence? Was it something darker? The truth remains tangled in testimonies, silence, and speculation. No conclusive evidence ever emerged to contradict the official ruling, but the inconsistencies left a shadow that time hasn't erased. The final hours of Ruslana's life were quiet, yet loaded with unspoken emotion. On the surface, the world saw another tragic headline. But beneath, her story carried layers that the headlines never touched: fear, longing, uncertainty, and perhaps forces that shaped her final decision more than anyone could prove. News outlets rushed to cover the tragedy, splashing her face across screens and newspapers. But the coverage was shallow, sensational. Phrases like "Russian Rapunzel jumps to her death" dominated headlines, stripping her humanity down to a single, romanticized tragedy. The focus wasn't on who Ruslana was or the pressures she faced, it was on her beauty, her mystery, and the spectacle of her fall. Tabloids treated her death like a plot twist in a fairy tale, not the loss of a young woman. This kind of coverage wasn't new. The fashion industry and media have a long history of turning women's struggles into entertainment, tragedies wrapped in glamour. Ruslana's story was no exception. Inside the fashion world, the response was muted. A few designers expressed their shock. Agencies issued brief statements of sympathy. But beyond that silence, no deep conversations, no accountability, no systemic reflection. For many, her death was treated as a sad anomaly, not a warning sign. The industry that had helped build her image now distanced itself from the pain behind it. It was easier to mourn quietly and move on than to confront uncomfortable truths about mental health, power imbalance, and the isolation so many young models faced. This silence spoke volumes. It revealed how disposable even the most beloved faces could become when tragedy struck back in Almaty. Her mother and friends were devastated. They couldn't accept the official story so easily. They remembered Ruslana as someone who was planning for the future, who had spoken about change, not giving up. Her mother questioned the investigation, pointing to unanswered details and inconsistencies. How could her daughter, who had just spoken to her hours earlier with no sign of despair, end up like this? The family's grief was compounded by distance. Their questions echoed across continents unanswered. Amid the grief, attention turned to Rose of the World, the self-development group Ruslana had recently attended. Investigations revealed intense practices, prolonged sessions, emotional breakdown exercises, and methods critics described as manipulative. Some former participants claimed the group encouraged radical emotional shifts, even cutting ties with old lives. The possibility that Ruslana was influenced, directly or indirectly, by such a group added a chilling layer to the narrative. While no evidence tied the organization directly to her death, the questions surrounding their influence highlighted how vulnerable young, searching individuals can be to charismatic, controlling systems. The aftermath of Ruslana's death was not just about grief, it was about what was left unsaid. Media distorted. Industry ignored. Family questioned. And a shadowy organization lingered at the edges of a tragedy no one fully explained. Time has a way of turning real lives into symbols. In the years after Ruslana Korshunova's death, her image lingered like a ghost through the fashion world, not in loud headlines anymore, but in whispers, photographs, and the quiet corners of internet forums where people still asked, what really happened to her? Ruslana was part of a generation of young women from Eastern Europe who defined an era of fashion. They arrived in the early 2000s, wide-eyed, talented, and unknown, and quickly became the faces that luxury brands built their campaigns upon. But just as quickly as they were celebrated, they were replaced. When the industry's gaze shifted, it didn't look back. Many of these models were left to navigate identity crises, financial instability, or quiet exits. Ruslana's story exposed a truth the industry rarely admits. Muses are often treated as fleeting trends, not human beings. Her image, flawless, ethereal, unforgettable, was used to sell fantasies. But when she needed grounding, that same world had nothing to offer. Her death became a painful symbol of how easily beauty can be commodified and forego in the wake of her passing. Conversations about mental health in modeling began to slowly surface. Other models started sharing their stories about isolation, exploitation, and emotional struggles hidden behind perfect photos. Ruslana's death wasn't the first, nor the last, but it became a reference point for those calling for change. Documentaries, investigative articles, and fashion forums revisited her story, not as gossip, but as a mirror reflecting the darker side of glamour. Her name started appearing in discussions about better support systems for models, mental health resources, legal protections, and transparency in agencies. Her short life echoed far beyond her time on the runway. She became a reminder that behind every iconic image is a real person with fears, hopes, and fragility. When people remember Ruslana, they often recall the photographs, the flowing hair, the fairy tale look, the angelic gaze. But beneath that myth was a young woman from Almaty, curious, poetic, searching. Her story isn't just about a tragic fall. It's about the cost of existing inside a system that glorifies perfection but neglects humanity. It's about how easily someone can be seen by millions and still feel invisible. If there is one legacy in her story, it's this: beauty should never come at the price of a person's soul. Her life, though brief, cracked open conversations the industry had long ignored. And in those conversations, her presence endures not as a myth, but as a warning and as a memory. Ruslana Korshunova, 1987 to 2008, not just the face of a fairy tale, but a voice that still whispers through fashion silence.